The first groups of Japanese prisoners reached American shores in the summer of 1943. They came in guarded transports, eyes hollow from hunger and disbelief, their minds clouded by what their officers had told them capture meant shame, starvation, perhaps even execution. The code of Bushido had drilled into them the idea that to fall into enemy hands was worse than death. Yet the docks they stepped onto did not match these expectations. The warehouses along the coast were stacked high with supplies, the piers humming with cranes unloading endless streams of cargo. The United States seemed to be a continent-sized machine in constant motion. The men were silent as they were marched past warehouses where crates bore stenciled words like Chicago or Kansas. They saw mountains of food flour sacks piled higher than their own barracks roofs back home and trucks lined up in orderly rows waiting to carry the cargo inland. For men from a nation struggling to ration rice and fish, the sheer abundance looked almost unreal. But what unsettled them more was the demeanor of their captors. The guards were calm, businesslike, not cruel. Some even offered cigarettes. The prisoners had expected snarls, but found instead a world that did not even regard them as dangerous foes, just defeated men passing into the machinery of war. The journey inland took them across landscapes they had never imagined. From the windows of guarded trains, they watched fields stretch endlessly into the horizon, dotted with farmhouses, silos, and long convoys of tractors at work. One soldier, Private Takeda, would later write in a smuggled note that the sheer size of a single Midwestern farm seemed larger than his entire village in Kyushu. Cornfields rolled like seas, wheat glistened in the sun, and every mile carried the bitter realization that America possessed a depth of resources Japan could never match. When the train passed through cities, the shock deepened. Even under wartime conditions, electric lights glowed in windows, department stores remained open, and citizens walked freely without the dread of air raids. At night, the soldiers strained to see the skyline, bright and glittering, while they remembered Tokyo dimmed by blackouts and punctuated by bomb alarms. How they wondered. Could a nation at war look as if it were not suffering at all? By late 1943, the Japanese prisoners were distributed into camps across Texas, Arkansas, and the Midwest. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, neat wooden barracks awaited them. The fences and guard towers were there, but inside the compound they discovered order rather than chaos. Prison kitchens produced meals with meat, potatoes, bread, and even milk luxuries that had vanished from Japanese cities years before. The first meal many of them ate was recorded in astonished silence. One veteran, Sergeant Nakamura, whispered to another that the bread alone could have fed his family for a week. The POWs soon realized that they were not starved, but fed according to Geneva Convention standards. The routine included work details, literacy classes, and even occasional access to American newspapers, albeit censored, at night, as they lay on bunks with clean blankets. Some stared at the ceiling and asked themselves what strange kind of enemy treated captives with such abundance. Was this weakness, or was it the mark of a power so vast that it could afford mercy? In Japan, newspapers still proclaimed the superiority of the Yamato spirit, insisting that America was decadent, fragile, and divided. Yet the prisoners could see with their own eyes a very different picture. Every passing week added to the contrast. They heard the distant rumble of supply trains passing the camp, watched skies crisscrossed with aircraft in training flights, and saw guards in crisp uniforms supplied without shortage. By the end of their first month, the POWs whispered among themselves that something in their worldview was beginning to crack. They had been told America lacked resolve, but how could that be reconciled with the sight of trains so long they took 10 minutes to pass? How could it align with warehouses filled with trucks, when in Japan, even civilian bicycles were being stripped for scrap? The stage was set for deeper shocks to come, and the first would arrive not with a factory or a convoy, but with a sight even more unthinkable to men raised under strict codes of hierarchy, American women stepping forward to take the wheel of war. The morning sun of Texas cut through the mist as a group of Japanese prisoners were marched to a nearby work assignment in 1944. The road leading away from the camp was filled with dust and the growl of engines. At first, the prisoners thought nothing of the approaching convoy. They had already grown accustomed to seeing American trucks, massive vehicles dwarfing the small transport lorries of their homeland. But then, as the trucks drew closer, they saw something that made them stop mid-step. Behind the steering wheels were not men in uniform, but women young, confident, their hair tied back beneath caps, hands steady on the wheel. To men raised in a society where women were confined to domestic spheres, this was more jarring than any industrial marvel. In Japan, the very idea of a woman handling military machinery was unthinkable. Yet here, in broad daylight, rows of trucks thundered past, each one driven by women in coveralls, chewing gum, sometimes waving at the guards, as if the war itself were only part of their daily routine. Private Takeda, who had once seen his mother bow at the door whenever his father entered, muttered that the world had been turned upside down. These women were part of the Women's Army Corps WWII, which by 1945 had enrolled over 150,000 members. Many served as clerks or nurses, but thousands took up roles once thought exclusive to men driving supply convoys, repairing engines, even instructing male recruits in vehicle maintenance. At Fort Bliss in Texas, convoys of 30 trucks a day rolled toward depots, often staffed entirely by female drivers. The Japanese prisoners watched as these convoys passed their camp's perimeter roads. The women shifted gears smoothly, hauling crates of ammunition and food. The sight was not a show staged for propaganda, it was routine, daily reality. Captain Sato, a stern officer who had lectured his men on the weakness of American women, found himself staring in silence as one young driver leaned from her cab to shout directions to another later that evening. He wrote in his diary, "Our newspapers lied. If women here drive the machines of war, then their men are free to fight without burden. How can we hope to match such a nation?" Imperial propaganda had painted American women as frivolous, soft, corrupted by luxury. Posters distributed in Tokyo mocked them as idle consumers, but the POWs now saw women filling roles that in Japan only soldiers or laborers could perform. The contradiction gnawed at them. The war they thought they understood was beginning to dissolve in their minds. For Sergeant Nakamura, who had once commanded conscripts in Burma, the most unbearable moment came when he overheard guards joking about their sisters working as drivers back home. Sisters, he whispered, incredulous, in Japan. The idea of a sister handling a military truck was unimaginable. Yet in America, it was so normal that it was spoken of casually, even proudly. Day after day, the POWs saw more evidence. Women brought convoys of fuel to the depots, maneuvered jeeps through muddy roads, and supervised the loading of crates. The prisoners noted the scale in 1944 alone. American women logged over 500 million miles of military driving duty. Numbers like these carried their own weight. To men who had marched starving across jungles with mules as their only transport, the very idea of women clocking 500 million miles behind the wheel was staggering. But even that was not the end. One afternoon, a prisoner named Ishikawa, once a mechanic in civilian life, was ordered to help clean a motor pool under guard. There he saw two women bent over an engine, their hands stained with oil, tools clinking in rhythm. One laughed as she tightened a bolt. The other called for a wrench. Ishikawa froze, unable to reconcile what he saw. Later he confided to his comrades, "When women in America repair engines, it is as if the war itself is endless for them. Nothing will exhaust such a nation." That night, as lanterns glowed inside the barracks, the men whispered about what they had seen. The strongest warriors of the emperor, now humbled, were forced to confront a reality they could not explain away. If America could mobilize not just its men, but also its women, where did Japan stand? The question lingered like smoke in the barracks. No one answered it aloud. Yet, in the silence between bunks, each man felt the same cold realization the world they had believed in was collapsing piece by piece. And still, beyond the barbed wire, more shocks awaited, this time in the thunder of machines and the endless roar of factories that no nation could hope to rival. In the spring of 1944, work details brought several groups of Japanese prisoners into contact with American supply depots. The camps were often located near hubs of wartime logistics, and through the fences the prisoners could glimpse the rhythm of industry. One morning in Arkansas, a convoy of trucks rolled toward a vast depot warehouse, its walls of corrugated steel gleaming in the sun. The drivers dismounted again women, their coveralls streaked with grease, their laughter echoing across the yard. Inside, Forklifts maneuvered pallets of ammunition and crates of food for the prisoners. It was like stepping into a vision of another civilization. Private Takeda, the same soldier who had once stared in disbelief at bread rations, tried to count the forklifts. There were more than 24. He thought of Japan, where dock workers unloaded ships by hand, using ropes and bare backs. In a single minute, one forklift lifted what a team of men would need an hour to carry. The contrast was unbearable. Takeda muttered, "If machines are their soldiers, then how can flesh resist steel?" The prisoners soon learned that what they saw in the depots was only a fraction of the larger picture. America's industrial war machine drew on the labor of millions of women. By 1944, nearly 6 million women were working in war industries, and over 2 million of them in manufacturing alone. Factories across Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles produced tanks, jeeps, and trucks on a scale that defied imagination. Reports trickled into the camps the Ford Motor Company had converted its plants to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, rolling one off the assembly line every 63 minutes. At Willow Run, women riveters stood side by side with men, fastening aluminum sheets that would soar over Europe within days. For Japanese prisoners steeped in a culture where women were confined to household labor, the revelation was devastating. Captain Sato, watching a newsreel shown by American guards, wrote bitterly, "We were told women of the West were weak, yet they are the backbone of a storm that will crush us." The numbers that filtered through to the camps deepened the sense of unreality. In 1943 alone, American factories produced more than 86,000 tanks and nearly 300,000 aircraft. Truck production surpassed 800,000 units in a single year. Some of these vehicles rolled past the POW camps daily, driven by women who seemed almost casual in their mastery. Sergeant Nakamura, once a commander in Burma, recounted to his bunkmates a chilling detail. A single American depot stored more spare parts for jeeps than the Japanese army had jeeps in the entire Pacific theater. The arithmetic of war was brutal, and in the silence that followed, no one could argue. The prisoners began to notice something subtler: the rhythm. Shifts rotated day and night. Convoys ran at precise intervals, and depots functioned with clockwork regularity. There was no pause, no sign of fatigue. Unlike the collapsing infrastructure of their homeland, where scarcity forced workers into exhaustion, America's system seemed infinite. One evening, a group of POWs were marched past a motor pool as women mechanics prepared trucks for night convoys. The clang of tools, the hum of engines, and the sight of women organizing checklists left them speechless. Ishikawa, the former mechanic, whispered, "This is not war as we know it. This is a war of nations as machines." His words spread in whispers through the barracks, repeated like an omen. With every revelation, the boundaries of what the prisoners thought possible expanded. A single factory produced more trucks than Japan had in its entire army. A single assembly line employed more women than an entire Japanese regiment. These facts were not propaganda, they were visible, countable, undeniable. The prisoners felt themselves shrinking, their once proud sense of superiority dissolving. Each new figure they learned, each new sight they witnessed, eroded the last defenses of their old ideology. If women could drive, repair, and even build the engines of war, then Japan's rigid world had already lost long before the bombs would fall. But still, greater revelations were waiting in the cold mathematics of production, in numbers so vast that they would strip the last illusions away. By the summer of 1944, the prisoners had grown accustomed to sights that once seemed impossible: women behind the wheels of convoys, mechanics with oil-stained hands. Yet when the scale of American production was revealed, disbelief hardened into dread. The guards themselves sometimes spoke casually of figures that to the prisoners sounded absurd. 3 million trucks, one sergeant said with a shrug. At first, the POWs thought it was a joke, but quartermaster records confirmed it by the end of the war. The United States would produce more than 2.3 million trucks and over 6 million military vehicles in total. Private Takeda, trying to comprehend the number, calculated aloud that if each vehicle were lined bumper to bumper, the convoy would stretch from Tokyo to Berlin. His bunkmates laughed bitterly, but none denied the truth. What they had once dismissed as boasting now confronted them as mathematics. Numbers, unlike propaganda, could not lie. Figures passed into the camps in fragments through newsreels, conversations with guards, or glimpses of American newspapers. By 1945, 350,000 women had served in uniform in the U.S. military, and more than 400,000 had been trained in transportation or technical roles in factories. Nearly 1 in every 3 workers was female. These were not exceptions, but norms. A mobilization so thorough that it dwarfed the entire population of some Japanese prefectures. For men taught that women were to be silent, obedient, and invisible in war. The figures stung like open wounds. Ishikawa, the mechanic, tried to explain it to his comrades: if women drive the trucks, then the men fly the planes. If women build the planes, then the men fight at the front. This is how America multiplies its strength. His words sank into the silence of the barracks, echoing a realization none could resist. The prisoners already knew Japan had strained to produce aircraft in sufficient numbers. In 1944, Japanese factories built roughly 28,000 planes. That seemed immense until they heard that American factories produced over 96,000 aircraft in the same year, 3 times as many while still supplying trucks, tanks, and ships at parallel rates. Sergeant Nakamura recalled standing outside one evening as a squadron of training aircraft flew overhead in neat formation. "Those are practice planes," a guard explained. The word alone was devastating. In Japan, practice flights were luxuries. Here, even training consumed fleets of planes, each one newer and more advanced than Japan's frontline aircraft. The prisoners stared skyward, unable to reconcile the sight with the slogans of Yamato superiority they had been fed. At Camp McCoy, a single supply truck rolled into the compound one morning, driven by a woman no older than 20. She unloaded crates marked with rations, cigarettes, and medical supplies to the POWs. The act seemed ordinary enough until one of them noticed a maintenance log attached to the vehicle. It recorded that the truck had already traveled 40,000 miles in service, nearly twice the length of Japan's home islands from north to south. And still, the machine functioned perfectly. The note passed among prisoners like contraband, if one truck could survive such punishment. What did it mean for fleets numbering in the millions? Captain Sato wrote in his diary, "We are ants counting the wheels of an elephant. Every mile they drive is another step toward our destruction." In the barracks, the prisoners began to trade figures the way gamblers whisper odds. 300,000 aircraft. One would say 80,000 tanks. Another replied, each number was a stone added to a wall pressing down on them. The collapse of illusion was no longer emotional, it was statistical. The war was lost not in the jungles of Burma or the seas around the Philippines, but in the arithmetic of production. And yet, even as the numbers stripped away their pride, another dimension remained the human one. What unsettled them most was not the machines themselves, but the people behind them, women who smiled as they drove, who joked as they loaded supplies, who carried the war forward with hands that, in Japan, would never have touched a steering wheel. By late 1944, the Japanese prisoners had ceased to argue about the numbers. The arithmetic of defeat was clear. What remained was the inner struggle to reconcile their old beliefs with the new world they were witnessing. This battle unfolded not in open debates, but in hushed conversations after lights out, in half-torn scraps of diary pages hidden under mattresses, in the words men dared not speak aloud to guards. One evening at Camp Huntsville in Texas, Private Takeda whispered to Sergeant Nakamura that he had dreamt of his mother in his dream. She was carrying buckets of water along a dusty road. He woke and compared the vision to the women he had seen driving 3-ton trucks past the camp. "In Japan," he murmured, "our mothers carry buckets. Here, theirs carry nations." Nakamura said nothing, but the lines spread quietly through the barracks like a proverb. Some prisoners attempted to capture their astonishment in letters, though censored. Fragments survive in archives. One officer wrote to his brother, "I have seen women in uniform directing traffic for convoys of 50 trucks. Imagine such a sight on the streets of Tokyo. It would be called madness. Yet here it is order." Another wrote bitterly, "If women in America command machines, then perhaps we are already relics of another age." Many of these letters never reached Japan. Yet the act of writing itself was a confession, a way of processing a reality too heavy to carry in silence. The guards who censored them often laughed at the phrasing. not realizing the words were small fractures in an ideology once thought unbreakable. Occasionally, American guards or civilian workers spoke to the POWs directly. At Camp McCoy, a guard boasted that his sister had learned to drive a truck before she turned 18. The prisoners listened, incredulous. In their homeland, an 18-year-old girl might still be kneeling to pour tea for elders. One prisoner, Ishikawa the mechanic, asked cautiously if the story was true. The guard shrugged. "She's better with an engine than me." That night, Ishikawa told his bunkmates, "I once believed no woman could surpass me in skill. Now even that pride is stolen." His words drew no protest. The silence itself was agreement. Despite the growing cracks in their worldview, the men rarely admitted them openly, in public, especially when officers were nearby. They clung to the posture of disdain. They dismissed the women drivers as oddities, exceptions, but in the privacy of diaries. Another tone emerged. Captain Sato's entries became increasingly reflective. "I was taught that to be captured was dishonor, that to see our enemies' women was humiliation. Yet I feel something different, an ache that our empire never gave women such power. Perhaps strength is not only in the sword, but in the wheel that carries it." For a man of his rank, such words were close to heresy, but he wrote them anyway, perhaps sensing that history was already moving beyond his command. What disturbed the prisoners most was not a single moment of shock, but the accumulation of them. Each convoy, each statistic, each glimpse of a woman driving past with effortless control added another crack to the walls of their certainty. At night, they whispered questions once unthinkable. Was the Emperor truly divine if his armies could be outpaced by women truck drivers? Was the Yamato spirit enough if numbers and engines carried more weight than courage? No answers came, only silence. And in that silence, the foundations of their old world dissolved. But the final blow was yet to come, not in whispers or diaries, but in the collapse of an entire illusion. When the prisoners realized that these women and their machines were not temporary wartime measures, they were the future, and it was a future that had already left Japan behind. By early 1945, the war outside the camps was reaching its climax, but inside the wire, the greatest battles were fought in silence in the minds of the prisoners. What had begun as disbelief when they first saw women at the wheel of military trucks now hardened into something heavier acceptance. The old lessons of superiority, hammered into them by officers and propaganda, no longer held sway. At Camp McCoy, a group of prisoners stood near the fence as another convoy rumbled past. A young woman in uniform leaned out of the cab, shouted to a fellow driver, and adjusted her cap with casual confidence. The prisoners said nothing, no whispers of mockery, no defiance, only silence. In that moment, they understood the world had changed, and they were watching it leave them behind. At first, many had believed women's roles were temporary, an emergency solution until men returned from the front. But as the months passed, they realized this was not improvisation, but integration. In towns near the camps, they saw women in uniform walking to depots, women supervising rail shipments, women filling offices with typewriters that coordinated entire supply networks. The sight repeated itself too often to be dismissed. Sergeant Nakamura remarked to Ishikawa, "In Japan, women bow when soldiers pass. Here, soldiers salute women at the wheel." The words struck like a blow. What had seemed unshakable, the hierarchy of gender, the definition of power, was unraveling in front of them. News from home, smuggled through rumor and fragmentary Red Cross messages, told a different story. Japanese cities starved under rationing. Mothers scraped to find rice. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Factories strained to build weapons, yet still lagged far behind America's pace. The contrast was unbearable. Private Takeda once stood at the camp's edge as a convoy rolled by, engines growling, dust rising into the sun. He whispered, "At home, our sisters stand in breadlines. Here, there's command convoys." His voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. Imperial propaganda had always painted Americans as soft, divided, lacking discipline. But the prisoners now saw something else, a society that had mobilized not just its soldiers, but its civilians, men and women alike. The illusion of superiority was dead. In one barracks, Captain Sato read aloud a passage from his diary to his men. "If the future belongs to those who adapt, then our empire is already in the past." A woman at the wheel of a truck carries more weight than all our slogans. The men listened, and none dared to disagree. For officers who once punished dissent, silence itself was confession. When the news of Japan's defeats in Saipan, Leyte, and finally Okinawa reached the camps, the prisoners did not shout or argue. They simply nodded. By then, they had already seen the evidence of inevitability in the endless lines of trucks, the efficiency of depots, the laughter of women who drove as though the war were only another day's work. It was not bombs alone that crushed their spirit. It was the sight of a nation that could expand its strength endlessly, drawing on every hand, every mind, every engine, to men raised in a rigid, insular world. That realization was the true defeat. And as the convoys roared beyond the wire, carrying supplies that stretched across oceans, the prisoners understood the war was lost long before the surrender. It had ended the moment they saw a young American woman turn the wheel of a truck and carry the weight of an empire in her hands.